All right, well, thank you all for being here. This is going to be the first of our events that we're calling our Pro People Lawyering Series. We're bringing in attorneys, some organizers, folks working towards advancing justice in all different ways so that our law students, our early career attorneys, even our more established attorneys who just want something new can get a sense of what's going on out there and how people are fighting for justice every day. And for our kickoff event in this series, I'm really excited to be joined by Eric Tars, who is the Senior Policy Director at the National Homelessness Law Center, also one of my externship directors from when I was in law school, an amazing time at NHLC. So I'm really excited to have Eric here with us today. So the way this is going to work is I'll be asking some questions. We'll be in conversation for a little while, and then any questions that you have as they come up, drop them in the Q&A. I'm going to pull a bunch of those out at the end so we can put those to Eric as well. So to kick us off, Eric, if you could just introduce yourself and kind of let us know what brought you to your current position at NHLC.
Yeah, thanks, Steve, for having me and to the People's Parity Project, who we've done a ton of great work with over the years, including having a kind of spin-off project from one of the students, Alex Matak, who then became an Equal Justice Works Fellow and helped to kind of fully realize our legal defense clinics project. Coming out of a PPP project. So yeah, I'm Eric Tars. I'm currently the Senior Policy Director at the National Homelessness Law Center, where I have been for the last 18 years, which is crazy. And came to this work, the kind of long view of it is that my father was born in a refugee camp during World War II and grew up for the first several years of his life in a variety of refugee camps. And so I grew up just always with a sense of how lucky I was to have been born where and when I was, I wouldn't have named it privilege at the time, but kind of into this privileged environment, and always had a sense that like I needed to use this privilege to be able to work to make sure that people like my dad wouldn't be treated any worse than I would have wanted to see for my own father. And so uh, growing up, I thought that meant doing international human rights work, and that was kind of where my career trajectory was headed for a long time. But then when I was in law school, I was working with a professor, Mari Matsuda, who's one of the founders of the real critical race theory, not the critical race theory advertised by the right wing as being taught in kindergartens. And she was working on an article on the racial discrimination in education and privatization of public education in the US. And she said, do these international human rights theories that you're working on apply to issues of racial discrimination here in the US? And I said, oh my God, yes, they do. But nobody's talking about international human rights in the US, and these standards are so much better than this shit law that we have here. So why aren't we doing this? And that kind of became my eureka moment where I said I need to apply this universe of international human rights mechanisms and standards to issues, social justice issues domestically. And luckily, as I was graduating law school, back in the early 2000s, we were kind of coming into this rebirth of a US human rights movement, and the National Homelessness Law Center, a few years later, actually got some funding to hire me to kind of bring this view that housing is a human right into the advocacy of the organization, into our legal advocacy, into our policy advocacy, and into our organizing strategies. And so that's kind of where I started, and then have moved through different positions and different areas of focus over the past few decades. But you know, that's still, you can see, still my passion. Um, uh, but really thinking comprehensively about what it means to make what it would look like for housing to be a human right in the US. And having worked at the organization as long as I have, like I have the advantage of being able to see this arc of the work, the seeds that I planted, 15 years ago, now kind of finally coming to fruition, where we have, members of Congress, the president, including as part of his platform, and current presidential candidate Harris, who have actually said housing is a human right. Things that I was told were, laughable back when I started doing this work. And so, yeah, there's a long, long way to go, but being able to see that kind of progress makes me confident that we are, bending that arc of history towards justice. You are on mute, so I cannot hear you.
Thank you. But no, thank you. That's great. I always love hearing stories like this where, I think something that law school doesn't do a great job of teaching students is to be open to like all kinds of different opportunities. There are certain things you're supposed to do. Here, all your gold stars you're supposed to go chase and whatever. But I was like hearing just like, well, I hadn't thought I was going to do this, but it aligned with my values and what I was interested in, and now here I am. You've been doing this for decades, like
Yeah,
you
yeah,
said.
no. If there was one thing
Wasn't
I knew when I graduated college, it was that I wasn't going to go to law school. If there's one thing I knew when I graduated law school, it was that I wasn't going to do litigation. I was only going to do policy work, and here I am 18 years later, having just fought this Supreme Court case. So, definitely being open to wherever the work takes you is very important.
awesome. Yeah, that's great. So could you describe the work that NHLC does and how you combine litigation, advocacy, and organizing into kind of a coherent strategy to combat homelessness and push for the right to housing?
Um, yeah, I mean, we try to make it as coherent and pretend we know what we're doing as possible, but a lot of it is making it up as we go along. Um, but yeah, I mean, we very much see ourselves as, aspiring to be a movement lawyering organization, to the extent we can be working from a national level. It's it's I think it's always a work in progress, and if we if we feel like we've figured it out, there's always an organizer to come along and tell us that we haven't gotten it all perfect yet. And so it's I think it's good to always feel that tension and know that like there's more that we could be doing. Um, but we really understand that, particularly for my work is in housing as a human right, um, that like with the court cases that we are fighting, for example, this Grants Pass case that we'll talk more about in a bit, um, uh, the most we could have won out of that case would have been the right not to be criminally or civilly punished uh, for sleeping or sheltering yourself outdoors when there's no indoor alternative. And that doesn't actually get anybody into housing, which is ultimately what we want. And so, you know, what we knew that like win or lose in that case, in order to get to our end goal, which is ending homelessness, we were going to have to do a lot more work. And so, and we knew given the setup of the Supreme Court, there's a better than even chance that we weren't going to win. And so we went into our case strategy there, looking to use the moment of national attention with a Supreme Court case, um, uh, to try to advance this movement to build out our network to other groups whose issues intersected with homelessness, with criminalization of homelessness, but who, it's not their 9 to 5 bread and butter that the way it is for our organization, because we knew that we are never going to get the resources that we need to actually end homelessness if it's just the homelessness movement itself. We don't have that kind of political clout, but if we can show folks from the racial justice movement, the disability justice movement, the LGBTQ justice movement, that this issue is their issue as well, and that all those groups are disparately impacted by homelessness and housing insecurity, and the criminalization of homelessness, and the best way to prevent criminalization of homelessness is simply to make sure people aren't on the streets in the first place to be criminally punished because they have adequate housing. Then all of us working together, that gives us much more of a chance of actually passing the policies that we need to create and help people enjoy the right to housing in the US. So we're kind of always thinking, litigation is one tool in the tool belt of the movement. We are happy to be that legal arm of this national movement to end homelessness. But we need to be doing it in coordination with all these other pieces. And we need to be taking leadership from those who are most directly impacted in the work. So as part of our strategy around this case, we did have some legal strategies focused on the 9 folks who sit in the Supreme Court. But we had a much bigger strategy around communications, around reaching out to cultivate strategic amicus briefs, and again, strategic being some of them geared towards the members of the court, but some of them just being kind of opportunities for us to network with other groups and help them start to take on this issue as their own issue, that we're then going to continue building on going into the future. So it's really and also working with Congress, to cultivate an amicus brief for the case, but really using it as an opportunity to organize and educate members of Congress about issues of criminalization of homelessness more broadly, and build that awareness, build those relationships, so that coming out of the case, we can mobilize them in whatever ways we need to, either defensively or hopefully affirmatively towards getting actual housing resources. Same thing at the state and local level. We got a bunch of states attorneys general to sign on to a brief. We got 150 plus local officials. So we're like building out these networks as part of our legal strategy, but as part of a much broader organizing and policy strategy as well.
No, that's great. I think that's something that like I've always really appreciated about NHLC's work is just that kind of broad-based strategy. Because I think like, not gonna name any names or anything, but I think, there are some organizations that are very dedicated to this kind of like 70s idea of like what litigation can do. And I think what's more realistic is the way that you put it, is it just like this is an important tool in our toolkit, but it's absolutely not everything. And I think that you all do a really great job of kind of providing that kind of support while recognizing that this is just like a small kind of piece of the pie here. It's like as far as what this overall strategy needs to look like. So I think that's something that I think is kind of key to like, it seems key to kind of what you all are doing, key to what PPP is kind of putting forward. So yeah, no, that's great to hear. I really
Yeah, I
yeah.
think a way, yeah, an analogy that I make is like the NAACP was working, both uh in the streets and in the courts.
Yeah.
Um, and back in the 1920s, they were bringing cases that they were like strategically losing. It was, that they couldn't, the law wasn't supporting them yet, but they were using those court cases to build the movement, to build awareness, um, and took them 20 plus years to move from those cases up to like Brown v. Board and subsequent decisions that kind of recognize this right to non-discrimination, to equal treatment. And then it took another 20 years past that to get to the civil rights amendments. And then, you know, here we are, decades later, and our communities are still as segregated as they once were. Education is still as segregated as it once was. Um, but people look back and they say, I can't believe there was a time when it was legal to segregate. Um, and so in a similar way, like I'm hoping it doesn't take that long. Um, but like I'm hoping even though we lost this case now, like we are building this long-term arc of legal cases together with a social movement that's going to bring us to this place where culturally, sometime 50 years in the future, people will look back and say, I can't believe there was a time when we didn't recognize housing as a human right, when we let our fellow Americans become homeless. Um, and and it's not going to be a linear path, but like I think we have to be doing that cultural work in order to advance the legal work. It wasn't until we got to the Warren Court that and a shared social sense that we couldn't do those things anymore, that the court was felt empowered to kind of make the decisions. And so it's this, in some places the court was leading society, and in some places society was leading the court. And it's if you're not doing work in both areas, then the legal tools you have at your disposal are going to be more limited.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Thank you for that. So like on some of that, I guess, like so for people who haven't been following us closely, could you just describe like what the decision in Grants Pass did and how you expect it to affect the efforts to combat homelessness that you all are working on?
Yeah, so this is a case, Johnson versus Grants Pass, came out of a small city in Southern Oregon, that, like many US cities, has about doubled in size over the past 20 years, but they have not doubled their supply of affordable housing in that time. And so rents have been skyrocketing, and people have started losing their homes. The city started seeing this kind of manifesting in the early 2000s, and rather than saying, oh my God, our neighbors are becoming homeless, let's work to get them back inside, instead said, like, we want to just make it, this is a quote from one of the city councilors, let's try to make it so uncomfortable that people have to move on down the road. And so they passed a series of ordinances, including an anti-camping ordinance. But camping is very broadly defined to include use of any form of bedding. So a piece of cardboard under you, a blanket wrapped around you. As soon as you do one of those things, you could be committing a crime, but only if you're homeless. It's only if you intend to create a temporary habitation. So if you have a permanent habitation, a residence that you can go back to, you can go out to the park, you can lay down a blanket, you can take a nap, you can stargaze, that's perfectly legal. But if you don't have a permanent place to go to, uh, then you are, by definition, creating a temporary habitation, and therefore the law only applies to your activity that you actually need to do. The people who have the option of doing those things inside aren't subject to it, but only the people who actually need to do it to survive are subject to this law. Not that the Supreme Court recognized that. But so, yeah, in this time, the city also had the ability to get resources to create homeless shelters and other facilities, has explicitly declined to do that, including getting resources during the pandemic, and with some of the American Rescue Plan and subsequent legislation, they have declined funding from the state to create homeless shelters, and instead has pursued like only this punitive approach. And so Gloria Johnson, John Logan, Deborah Blake, and a number of their other homeless neighbors filed a lawsuit back in 2018, right on the heels of a case that the National Homelessness Law Center brought called Martin versus Boise, which created this precedent in the Ninth Circuit that said you can't criminally punish people experiencing homelessness for sleeping, sheltering themselves, taking steps to survive when there is no indoor alternative. It doesn't say you can't have those laws on the books. It doesn't say you can't enforce them. It only says you can't enforce them if there's literally nowhere else where people can actually be. And so the only reason you want to overturn that is if you want to be able to continue to enforce these laws without even bothering to have to make sure that there's any other place where people could actually survive. Which, to me seems like the definition of cruel and unusual punishment. And the lower courts agreed. The Ninth Circuit affirmed. But there's a really powerful group of folks who wanted to see this overturned, led by a law firm based out of Los Angeles, Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher, and a particular attorney there, Tiani Evangelis, who is part of the downtown LA business alliance, I guess, or I don't know what the formal name is, but is very involved there. And she really wants LA to be able to enforce laws against people experiencing homelessness, even though Los Angeles manifestly does not have enough shelter space for everybody there. And so it's been kind of her personal crusade to cultivate these cases to try to overturn the Martin versus Boise precedent. And this was the case that the vehicle that she found to eventually tee this case up for the Supreme Court. And so, yeah, like I said, we went into the case this spring, once the court accepted it for cert back in January, with this dual mission of trying to win in the court. We thought we had some very solid arguments, and could appeal to some of the justices, Catholic religious teachings that would say you should, welcome the stranger, and lots of things that we learn in that people learn in Sunday school, should make it obvious that using these laws to punish people who simply can't survive would be wrong. But and we thought that some of our arguments landed based on what we saw in the oral arguments. Justice Kavanaugh, for example, put it directly to the city's attorney saying, so you're going to arrest somebody, throw them in jail for 30 days for not having a home, and then they're going to get out with, now an arrest record, and still no housing. Like, how have you helped solve homelessness by doing this? And it really seemed like he got it. But, fast forward a few months and we got a 6-3 decision with, all of the conservative appointees lined up against us. And so that was, for me, probably the most disappointing part of it was like I thought we might peel off at least one or two of the conservatives. And I thought that even if we didn't, they might give us some more dicta to kind of say other avenues that we might pursue. And at the end of the day, they didn't even give us that. And it like really, the fact, even though that was kind of from the conservatives, um, even with our supposedly more progressive administration and supposedly progressive Democrats out in the field. Folks like Gavin Newsom, Mayor London Breed of San Francisco, Todd Gloria in San Diego, submitted briefs asking the court to take the case, and then submitting briefs in favor of neither party, that really reflected that this isn't a partisan issue, that there are folks who are kind of conceding to the business interests, desire to be able to quickly erase homeless people from specific areas of town, even if they aren't actually solving the underlying problems. And there's a line in one of the briefs in the U.S. Statement of Interest, where it kind of lists out all of the reasons why criminalization of homelessness is bad policy, and then it says the U.S. is also the nation's largest landholder or landowner. And basically, sometimes we want to be able to kick homeless people off our land anyway. And it kind of like really crystallized for me that, this Constitution was written by white male landowners for their own protection. And that was true back in the 1780s and 90s, and it still operates that way today. And even an administration which has done a bunch of great other work around homelessness and around criminalization of homelessness still kind of comes down on the side of, we're going to operate to protect landowners against folks who don't have land. And so, yeah, that's kind of the most disappointing parts of it to me. And, you know, it doesn't stop the work that we're doing to try to end homelessness. It doesn't stop our attempts to use the courts to help slow down the criminalization of homelessness. We have other legal theories we can explore, but it definitely sets us back a number of steps, because now, because what we had seen in California and other places was that just by having this constitutional floor that said you can't enforce these laws unless there are adequate alternatives, it pushed California to invest 20 billion new dollars into trying to create those adequate alternatives. And it was just basic shelter, some more permanent housing, but it was something. It was something in a constructive, positive direction. And even if their motivation to do it was just by creating this, it'll allow us to enforce these ordinances in other places. It still promoted some of those constructive approaches, and now we don't even have that floor. And so my concern is that it's gonna, communities will say we don't even have to create alternative shelter. We can just take a criminalization approach, which actually costs twice as much as providing housing. But you can hide the cost of it in the jail budget and in the policing budget. You don't have to acknowledge it up front the way you do for housing. And so it's more politically convenient for lots of local officials to take that approach. My other major concern coming out of the case is that one of our candidates for president during his first term in office was trying to create concentration camps for homeless people to ship people out of downtowns and force them under threat of arrest into. Our Martin versus Boise case helped put a stop to that in his first term, but if he gets a second term, he's already put as part of his party, as part of his presidential platform, a return to this idea of creating massive encampments, concentration camps, where people will be forced to go under threat of arrest simply because they can't afford the rent in their communities. And the Supreme Court's decision here overturning that precedent basically paves the way for that should he want to go down that road. Even if he doesn't, a number of states have already started taking steps in that direction. And so it's it's a very bleak looking future when those are the kinds of solutions that are being discussed to the homelessness crisis, as opposed to we actually need to get people back into housing.
That's exactly what I was just thinking as you were talking. I was like, that is, yes, pretty bleak. So, but that being said, I want to call it a little bit of just like as you're talking through this. One thing that I think, we deal with similar issues at PvP, like in some of our like courts work and things like that. There are like certain elected officials, I don't know, C3 considerations. One is just like I'm not going to name any names, but there are people who you would expect to be kind of in your corner, and then they turn out not to be. California, in this case, seems like a great example. It's like supposed to be kind of like super blue state, and you seem to, you say you care about stuff like this. So like, do you have any advice for people working in some of these similar spaces where, like, again, you might expect certain elected officials to be on your side and they're not?
Yeah.
How do you deal with that? Like, how do you have like separate ways that you approach folks like that to try and kind of get them on board, or is it like you basically just have to treat them like they
Yeah, no, I mean it's complicated, and if I had the silver bullets, then we'd be further along than we are. But I think, you know, it's yeah, it's very complicated because they're not all bad. They are also taking more constructive steps in many cases. Um, and you want to continue to cultivate a relationship, but I think we need to be willing to also call out people and say, you know, here you are aligning yourself with the same policies that, uh, Donald Trump is promoting. Like, and is that a place where you actually want to be? Um, and uh, it's um, it can make things uncomfortable. I think this is really where we need to lean into movement strategy, and say like work across multiple organizations, and the role have different roles for different organizations. So for some organizations, that role will be, we're not going to directly confront this as much. And other organizations will call things out more directly, be more aggressive. Um, and you can even have like an inside outside game where, like, FDR kind of famously said, I agree with you on the merits of your argument, kind of, but now make me do it. Now bring the people in the streets so that I will have the political capital to be able to fight the battles I need to fight inside. And so, I think there's, as long as organizations themselves are all coordinated and say, like, we're going to be the ones who are going to say this is bullshit, we're going to be the ones who are kind of working more behind the scenes, and the ones who are, and you don't end up attacking each other for like not being strident enough or not being um accommodating enough. If you all know you're working towards the same ends and you're doing it in coordination, like that's the approaches, and that's the importance of having a real coordinated movement working on this. And historically, the homelessness movement has not been uh super strong and coordinated on that front. But we have gotten much better over probably the past 5 to 6 years, and particularly through the catalyst of this case, um, are starting to flex those muscles in a way that I think will help us be more effective. But yeah, at the local level, uh, yeah, I think it's really important uh to not just give people a pass because they are also, doing other good things. I think we have to be willing to call them out, or have at least some parts of the group call them out. Um, and in California in particular, like, they have made explicit their racial equity goals, in state policy. And we know that uh, criminalization of homelessness impacts everybody, but it significantly disparately impacts Black and Brown communities. Like, Black homeless people are 10 times more likely to be ticketed than white homeless people. We know that each one of those encounters uh, is more likely to lead to violence by the police against the people who are being targeted. In San Francisco, 1/3 of the use of force incidents were against people experiencing homelessness, even though they only make up like 3% of the population. And so this is the entry point for so much of the Black and Brown population into the criminal legal system. Um, and, calling that directly out, like, this is against your purported racial equity goals. If your value is truly pushing us towards racial equity, this is going to take us away from it. And making those kinds of connections explicit can, that's my theory of how we should be doing this. It obviously didn't work with Newsom. Uh, I mean, Newsom's first brief was in support of the Supreme Court taking the case. After there was, some back and forth between him and us and other allies in the media, his brief in at the merits stage of the case was actually in favor of neither party. And he said, like, we agree with this basic principle that the Eighth Amendment should protect this behavior, but we just want more kind of definition around the edges. I felt like that was a little bit disingenuous because once, like, getting the Supreme Court that's most likely to just overturn the case, like, they're not going to create nuance. They're just going to use it as a vehicle to overturn this. So, whether it was a genuine change of sentiment or not, it's hard to say. But, like, at least at that merit stage, he moderated a little bit based on, I feel like, the critique that we had offered, and realizing what he was actually kind of aligning himself with. So yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah, yeah, I think we've definitely experienced the same. Yeah, that makes sense. I really appreciate that response. Just watching the time, I'll make sure we have time for questions, and we'll kind of mash a couple things together for you for my last question. And basically, you talked a little bit about like, how you all are planning on moving forward, like, what some of the challenges that you see are, what the opportunities are. What are some of the ways that like law students and new attorneys can kind of plug into this effort? And then even just beyond this like specific issue, like what advice would you have for law students and early career attorneys looking to really have an impact like this kind of in the public interest?
Um, yeah, in terms of ways that law students and new attorneys can get involved, um, uh, one of the things that we have been working on, as I mentioned up at the top of the program, is this legal defense clinic approach. Um, Let me see if I can drop this link in the chat. Oh, do we have a chat? We don't even have chat. Oh,
There
there
is
it
a
is.
chat, I think, that
There it is.
only we can
Yeah.
actually type into. But yeah, you can go drop it.
Um,
And if not, I'll include it in the notes so we go in our post-event email.
but yeah, there we go.
I can send this
So,
please.
we kind of have developed this whole playbook of how to develop these legal defense clinics. If, you know, if communities are going to take this approach, what we know is that because many of these ordinances are enforced are just misdemeanor civil infractions, people never get attorneys. And so they just end up pleading out and never actually contest their cases. But my one movement strategy might be to try to challenge like every single one of these ordinances and just like you say this is the approach you want to take, this is the actual cost of it to your criminal justice system. Um, and so we're going to need tons of uh, attorneys and pre-attorneys helping to bring those cases and help set up some of these legal defense clinics, which are uh, it's like an explicit use of legal clinics as an organizing hub um, kind of model. And so, getting involved, helping, we don't have any of these directly on this model set up yet, but we're going to need them all across the country. So wherever you are, you could try to get one set up in your area. We are happy to try and support that. Um, yeah, and then obviously, um, in terms of how, things law students should be thinking about, um, my general advice to law students is when you're in law school, take the classes you want to take. Don't take the classes you think you have to take for the bar. I didn't take wills and estates. I didn't take corporations. I didn't take tax. Like, take those if you're interested in it. There's great reasons to take all of those courses, but if that's not your passion, you will get what you need for the bar through your bar review class. I passed the bar. I didn't take any of those classes. But take the classes, you know, uh, critical race theory, feminist legal theory, these classes that are going to help you change the way you think and analyze the world. Um, that's what law school is for, is to give you the space to really be able to tune up those skills in your mind. Any kind of substantive area of law, you'll be able to pick up along the way, but like use that law school space to really um, change the way that you question the baseline of how law and policy is designed to impact the world and how you can work within that system. Um, yeah. And do cool internships and fellowships with groups like ours and legal aid organizations build those skill sets, work in you know with movement lawyering organizations to see what it looks like to take leadership from the folks most directly impacted. And yeah, don't think that you are there to speak for people who can't speak for themselves. You're there to help those people learn how to speak for themselves and to use your position and privilege in the spaces where they aren't able to carry their message, but doing it with them, not for them. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think, it's funny because I feel like we'd never had this conversation when we were working together. It wasn't until afterwards, like I was done with law school, and you were like, "Yeah, totally, this is what you should do." And I was like, "Okay, good," because I feel the same way. That's what I did, and it's good to hear from somebody more established, just like this works,
Yeah.
because it's literally a work in progress. But yeah, I always love to share that kind of advice with current students, things like that. So that's great. It's always good to hear. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in chat. We do have one now, so I'm going to put this one to you. And if anything else comes up, we'll address those as well. But we have a question from our NYU chapter. How do you think about balance of strategies intended to strategically leverage loss against the risk of creating harmful law that creates obstacles for your own work down the line? And likewise, how do you go about bringing novel legal theories that courts will still be sufficiently receptive to that your claims don't get thrown out on a motion to dismiss?
Yeah, it's it is there's no clear and easy answer. And there's always going to be a tension. But if you are working together with groups on the ground who have a strategy for what they're going to do with a strategic loss, then you've got a strategic reason to do it. And if you think that's going to outweigh the harm that will be done by creating bad precedents, then it becomes worth it. Uh, you shouldn't be doing it out of coordination with local groups. And so, like, if you create this bad law, then there's nothing backing it up, and you've just created bad law. Then that's clearly not worth it. So it really is all about thinking about how does this one tool of legal advocacy fit into the larger strategy of the movement, and where can you use the court advocacy, even if it isn't successful, to draw attention, to build power, um, uh, to heighten contradictions and bring out hypocrisy in a way that's going to build power for the movement, so that even if you are going to take one step back, you're going to then move two forward, and you've got a path to see that. Yeah, it's yeah, again, there's no perfect equation, but if you're working in partnership with the directly impacted organizing groups, um, they're going to be the ones who like make that call with you, informing them fully about the harms that this may cause, but then it's their decision to make, and say, yeah, this will cause some immediate harm, but we see the greater good that it's going to be doing.
Yeah, no, I think that's I'm really glad to hear that. I feel like that's so important because it's like it goes to again just like NHLC strategy and I think what you see in more of these like movement spaces is just like the people closest to the problem or the people closest to the solution, like that kind of thing. And I think that from the lawyers that I talked to who like are worried about this kind of thing, it's like when you're fully abstracted from just like what's actually happening on the ground, I feel like it's easy to be just kind of like, well, it's like how do you decide how to move forward if somebody's not impacted, like by this actual issue? It's not just some like little legal game or whatever, like on the ground.
Yeah.
So yeah, you need to be in relationship with the people on the ground and understand like what's going to work for them. That's again, I think what I think is really great about the approach that you all take. So yeah, no, I think that's great.
Yeah, I
Um,
think, I mean, I think it takes some of the pressure off of you as an attorney to be able to say, like, these are the people who are going to be experiencing the impact of a loss. And so if they are willing to take that on, fully understanding what that impact means, and again, it's up to you as the attorney to explain what those impacts are and make sure that this is like informed consent or an informed decision. Um, uh, but yeah, then it's not your call. It's their call. Do we want to take this on, even knowing it's going to cause harm to us in the near term, in support of a longer term strategy?
mhm, nice. Um, I see that we're pretty much at the end of our times, unless someone has a really quick question. It's real quick, but I think maybe we'll call it there. Um, this has been great. How as always, I always love kind of being in conversation with you and just kind of thinking through some of these things. And I hope that everyone else got as much out of this as I did. And I will just hope this is okay, but I'll plug this for you. If you're ever looking for something really impactful to do, like while you're in law school, reach out to Eric. Like this working with NHLC was an amazing experience when I was in law school. So definitely.
And yeah, and I will flip it back and say, um, there are amazing groups that we are working with all across the country. So if you want to get involved with something closer to home, we have a bunch of efforts going on right now to try to codify the protections that we had in the Martin versus Boise and Johnson versus Grants Pass decisions down at the state or local level. So if you want to get involved with those, help, provide assistance to local organizing groups. Um, there's a lot of opportunity to do that right now. So yeah, I'm happy to drop my email into the chat. Chat. Um, and if folks want to be in touch, feel free. I'm also happy to talk with folks about law school, post law school, all that sort of stuff as well. I will be on vacation for next week, so if people reach out and don't hear back from me right away, definitely feel free to bump the message back up in a couple weeks.
Well, thank you again so much. This was great. Hope you enjoy your week off. And yeah, looking forward to see kind of where things move in the future. Thanks so
Thank
much,
you,
Eric.
Steve, for organizing, and yeah, whatever we can do to continue to be in partnership, happy to do it.
Definitely. Awesome. All right. Thanks, everybody.